Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. Another talk. Today, this afternoon, we're going to be talking about 100 plus years of war. What we're talking about here is what's usually known as the 100 Years' War between England and France, but it actually lasted 116 years. It has to do with some of the themes that go all the way back to the lecture we did earlier this afternoon, which is the Battle of Hastings and William the Conqueror. And it has to do, although this is 271 years, it began 271 years after the Battle of Hastings, it still is connected to the fact that the King of England had come from France and still owned property in France. The King of England was still the Duke of Normandy and had other possessions in France. And so the 100 Years' War was a series of conflicts between England, starting with King Edward III of England, the Valois kings of France, and then some other French nobility who were having troubles with the King of France as well. Since this lasted 116 years, it's kind of complicated to explain it all in 40 minutes. So I'm going to do the best I can to do that and give you an understanding of what was going on. I would back up and say that in 1054, Henry II, the King of England, had been successful in controlling larger parts of France than even William the Conqueror had. In fact, by the mid-1100s, under Henry II and his followers, England controlled not only England itself, but Wales, Ireland, and then in France, Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, and Aquitaine. So a huge part of France was actually controlled by the King of England, and technically was the property of the King of England. This was a big deal because, to give you an idea, just the province of Aquitaine in France produced more income than the whole country of England did. So these properties in France were very, very valuable and very, very important. And of course, England wanted them, the King of France wanted them back, and so there was all this conflict. After Henry II, when we get to King John of Magna Carta fame, you'll remember King John is the one that the nobles of England forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was a document that said that the King of England did not have absolute power, but rather that he had a responsibility to serve the people and that the nobles had powers too. Under King John, they lost all of the property in France, except for Aquitaine, which was probably the most valuable of all of them. And then we get into the Edwards. Edward I, which you heard about in the Scottish discussions, Edward I Longshanks, the one who was called the Hammer of the Scots, the one who battled William Wallace and others. Despite the fact the Scots don't think very much of him, he was a powerful king and a very efficient king, and he's seen as one of the best of the kings of England. His son, Edward II, was quite weak, and he ended up being deposed and imprisoned and eventually murdered by his wife, who was Isabella of France. So Edward II was murdered by his wife. Edward's son, Edward II's son, Edward III, comes along, and his mother has not changed much. She controls her son, Edward III. He becomes king, actually, when he's quite young. When he turns 17, he ends up forcing his mother to retire and arresting and executing his mother's lover, Roger Mortimer, and he takes a firm hand and really takes charge of it. Edward III is the key player in getting all of this started here. Now again, William of Normandy, who conquered England, became the King of England and the Duke of Normandy. He controlled Normandy, Maine, and although it's not colored here, Brittany. Well, the English kings later had taken over Anjou, areas down here of Aquitaine, and much other of the richest, some of the richest parts of France. And the French wanted them back. The real issue comes to us, and again, I'm sorry, we've got to look at some genealogy here. The issue has to do with the French throne. Although the English kings owned big chunks of France, they were tied in primarily because of Isabella of France. Philip III, Philip IV. When Philip IV who's called Philip the Fair, dies. He had several children. Louis X was king for 3 years, and then Philip V became king for 6 years. Then Charles IV became king, but when Charles died in 1328, who's next? Well, they look, Isabella, remember, powerful Isabella, the one who had her own husband thrown in the tower and then murdered later and controlled her son for a long time until she was forced into retirement. She had married Edward II, the one that she has deposed and thrown in the tower, and Isabella runs England for a while. They had a son, Edward III, that was born in 1312. Well, when the rest of these folks die, Edward III is the next in terms of direct line of succession. But the French are already ticked off by the fact that English own big chunks of France. They don't want somebody from England coming in to be the French king, and so they come up with a rule and says, no, you cannot inherit the throne through a female line. You can only inherit the throne through the male line. Meaning, they're not willing to accept Edward because he has a right to the throne through his mother Isabel. So instead, they go over to a cousin, the House of Valois, and they find Philip of Valois. They make him Philip VI, King of France. Well, that kind of ticks Edward III off. And he is insisting that he has a right to the throne. Well, Philip doesn't want to have a war with England, even though France is the most powerful nation around at that point. They still don't want to go to war, and so Philip says, look, we will stop complaining about the property you own in France if you will give up your claim to the throne and stop making this an issue. So Edward III says, fine, I will stop arguing that I should be the king of France if you leave our properties alone, which was fine for 9 years. And in 1337, I think it was, 37, Philip decides Aquitaine is too valuable, and he confiscates it. At that point, in fact in 1340, Edward says, you broke the deal. I, therefore, am going to declare myself the rightful king of France. And that's where the 100-Year War starts. Because of the claim that Edward had to the throne and the fact that he felt he had been lied to and cheated, having to do with the property in France, and they started a multi-generational war. Again, it's a little complicated because there are a lot of players in 116 years. What I want to do here, to try to give you an understanding of it, is talk about the various people on the English side, Edward III and his descendants or relatives, because there was a break in there, and then the House of Valois after Philip VI, and then I'm going to come back and talk about some of the major events in it. Is that fair? Because otherwise it's very hard to try to get through all this. These are the members of the House of Plantagenet and Lancaster that were, and I'll explain that in a minute, that were kings of England during the time of the 100 Years' War. The first one, of course, is Edward III. He's the one that started it all with his claim that because of his mother Isabella of France, he had a right to the throne, and then France confiscated the Aquitaine, and he started the war. His son was also named Edward. He was called the Black Prince. He wore dark armor. He was very successful in war. Well, Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, went to, and I'll talk about this in a minute, they spent a lot of their time in France fighting battles. They were doing what was called chevauchés, where they would travel across the countryside and just loot, just take whatever they wanted. The goal wasn't necessarily to get in a battle, as it was to just prove that they could do whatever they wanted and to take property, etc. Well, unfortunately, the Black Prince died shortly before his father did. So when the Black Prince died, then Edward III died. Richard II, who is the son of the Black Prince, becomes king. Richard II becomes king in 1357, and when he takes over, he's still a child, and so his uncles take over the rule of England as regents in his stead. And whereas Edward III had done a great job of building the country up. He was a wonderful king. Again, if you're not Scottish, he was a wonderful king. And unfortunately, the uncles of Richard II almost bankrupt England. They are in control of the treasury. They spending money on themselves and property and everything else. And so finally, when he gets old enough in 1397, Richard rebels against his uncles as regents and takes back control. And then a few years after that, he was fairly volatile. He had a real temper. A few years after he's gained control, he decides that he wants to go back and get revenge against his uncles and his families. And he has some of them executed, others he has exiled, and the ones that were exiled were disinherited. They didn't own any property or anything anymore. Well, one of his cousins, the son of John of Gaunt, was called Henry Bolingbroke. And he was exiled, he was disinherited, and he came back to England to try to claim his rights and his property, and Richard II wouldn't have anything to do with it. So Henry comes back again, and he brings an army with him. He returns in force in 1399. He is successful in deposing Richard. Richard is put into captivity and dies the following year in 1400. And Richard Bolingbroke then becomes Henry IV. I said Richard. Henry Bolingbroke becomes Henry IV. That's where we have sort of a change in the line. It's all still part of the house of Plantagenet, but we now have gone to the line of Richard Gaunt, which is the Lancaster line. All right? I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I'm going to talk about the War of the Roses. Henry the Fourth is the first naturally English-speaking king since before William the Conqueror. For 300 years, the kings of England, French was their first language. English, most of them learned English, but English was their second language until we get to Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. He's the first naturally English-speaking king. When Henry dies, his son Henry V comes in. Henry V was really a good king, and he was really good at war. He prosecuted the war with the French, did very, very well. He won the battles of Agincourt in 1415, and in fact he was so convincing in battle that the French made him the regent of France. Charles VI was the ruler in France at that time. They made Henry V the regent of France. Charles gave his daughter to Henry V as his wife, Catherine, and they said that when Charles the VI died, that Henry V would become the king of France, or his heirs. So at this point, in fact, for a long time in the 100 Years' War, it looked like the English were winning, even though France was expected, hands down, to have been more powerful. And all these battles are happening in France. I'll tell you why in a minute. Well, when Henry V died, his son Henry VI took over, and he is sometimes referred to as Henry the Mad. He had frequent mental breakdowns. When he was coherent, he did all right. But from time to time, he would have a breakdown. He would go mad and kill people around him. He killed several knights that were there to protect him. He did not recognize in his various periods of difficulty, didn't recognize his own family members, his wife or children. He thought he was made of glass and would not let anyone touch him lest he break. And so we get into a whole big issue there with Henry in terms of how is he going, what are we going to do with him? Finally, they depose him, and they took a long time to do this because part of the time he was fine. And he was the rightful king. Eventually, Richard of York, which is a cousin of his, takes over as regent, and we get into kind of a weird time that I'm going to talk about under the War of the Roses. So these were the 6 generations that were involved on the English side in the 100 Years' War. On the French side, we have the House of Valois. The first one, Philip VI, is Philip of Valois that was made the king instead of Edward III. And he's the one that after being on the throne for 9 years, he decides to confiscate Aquitaine, even though the promise had been made that they would leave the English properties in France alone. He just couldn't pass up such a deal. He was the first cousin to Charles IV the Fair, who was the king that died, and so they made him king at that point. When he died, his son, John II, who was known as John the Good, takes over. And John is the one who had to deal with the consequences of the Black Death. He became king in 1350. The Black Death had hit Europe in 1347 to 49. And the immediate consequences of that, when the Black Death struck, somewhere between 50 and 60% of the population of continental Europe died in a 2-year period. You look around the room, imagine half of these people being gone. And the nature of the Black Death, it was such a mystery because someone would be fine at breakfast and be dead before supper that night. It was a horrendous thing. There's never been anything quite like it. In fact, the Black Death was the reason why feudalism pretty much came to an end. This idea that there were workers who were almost slaves to the masters because there weren't enough people to work the fields. And it became a market-driven economy. People were asking for money to work because there weren't enough people to work anyway. There were a lot of changes in the whole culture because of the Black Death. Well, John the Good was the one who had to deal with that. And one of the reasons he's called the Good is in the Battle of Hastings, and I'll mention that in a minute, he was captured. And the English set a very high ransom for him. Well, he promised to pay it. And he didn't have enough money right away, so they let him go to go raise the money. And one of his younger son, Louis, was left with the British as a hostage, which is what they did in those days. Hostages were well treated. I mean, they weren't tied up in a dark room, but they were given palaces and servants and the whole thing, but they were not allowed to leave. Well, Louis escapes. And John the Good, who was a very honorable man, voluntarily goes back to the English and turns himself into them because he said, I promised you that my son would stay here until we raise the money, and so I'm back. And he was with the English until he died because they never did finish raising all of the ransom. After John II, we have Charles V comes into the scene. He is the next king. Charles V, who is called Charles the Wise. He is a really good manager. He manages the country really well. He stabilizes their economy. He establishes the first permanent paid army in continental Europe, and it does very well about winning back some of the property that has been lost. But unfortunately, Charles' V's son, who is Charles VI, also is called the Mad, or the Beloved, depending upon who you ask. And the reason for that was he did have mental illness. He became king at age 11. He was controlled, similar to the story in England. He was controlled by his uncles for a while. Eventually, he takes over. He is able to, because his father had raised taxes and had been pretty tough in order to stabilize the economy, the reason he's sometimes called the Beloved is when he actually takes over the authority from his uncles as the King of France, he reduces taxes and he makes it easier on the people, and so they called him the Beloved. But he also had periods of insanity. And so Charles the Mad, Charles the Beloved, depending upon who you ask or what time it is, because he was having real difficulties. And finally, the last one in the House of Valois that was involved in this is Charles VII. He's the real kicker. He was the best of the lot in terms of the House of Valois. He ended up being such a strong king, he took back virtually all the property that had been conquered by the English. And he is the one, he's known as Charles the Victorious for that reason. When he became king, and he remained as king for 39 years, and ended up driving the English off. They maintained no property in France other than the city of Calais, which they kept for 212 years until the 1500s. But so these are the main players. And by the way, one of the reasons that Charles the Victorious was so victorious is because he had Joan of Arc on his side. We're going to tell you the story of Joan of Arc here in a minute. All right. So let's back up and talk about some of the process. I've talked about the people. This is what it looked like in terms of the land that the English had taken from the French in the 12th and 13th centuries. The darkened areas here are all areas that the English had owned or had taken, especially early on in the process. Now, the context for the start of the 100 Years' War in 1337, the English controlled this area down here, Bordeaux. They also controlled some up here, but they claimed the right to Aquitaine and other areas that had been back and forth. They'd been lost under the Henry II and then been reclaimed under Edward III. So this is what we have at the start of the war. And part of it is because Aquitaine had been confiscated by Philip the King of France away from the English. The first major battle, and this made a huge difference, was in June of 1340. When Philip VI had a very powerful navy. Remember what I said about French Navy before? You know, William the Conqueror is the only time the French have ever been successful invading England. No matter how many ships they've got, they don't seem to be able to win against the British Navy. Well, the Battle of Sluys in 1340, the English completely destroyed the French Navy. Now what that meant was, from that point on, from 1340 on, the 100 Years' War was fought entirely in France. Because the English still had a navy, they would go to France. The French had no way to get to England. And so that meant the battles were fought in France. Now, one of the things is that should have been an advantage for France, because they had more men that they could draw on. They didn't have to transport them all by boat. They had lines of supply. They always had larger armies. They always were better supplied. And yet, until very near the end, under Charles the Victorious, they simply couldn't seem to win. Throughout the 14th century, England wins more and more critical battles. They retake Aquitaine and other areas, and they're beginning to stretch their control further and further. This is during the time of Edward III and his son, Edward the Black Prince, who never became king because he died just before his father did. One of the first of the major victories that the English had was the Battle of Crecy in 1346. Now, it's August 1346. Edward III leads his army of about 14,000 English soldiers. They're English, some Welsh, some Allied forces. And they come upon a much larger force of French, Genoese, and Majorcan soldiers led by Philip IV and at Crecy, which is in northern France. Now, the reason the Genoese were there, the Genoese were mercenary. Usually, they were mercenary. What am I trying to say? Not longbows, crossbow soldiers. They specialized in crossbow work. Well, this is the battle, probably more than any other single battle, that established the longbow as being the weapon of the Middle Ages. Because the longbow was something that was an English tradition. In fact, at one point, the King of England made it a requirement that every English man learn to shoot a longbow. Longbows were like 6 feet long, and unless you trained to shoot a longbow, they were made out of yew, unless you trained to shoot one, you couldn't do it. Unless your muscles were really prepared for this. Strong men who were not used to using a longbow could not pull a longbow. And yet it had become a tradition in England. It was not a tradition anywhere else. In fact, you will notice here, you know which side's the English, because they've got longbows, and on the side of the French, they've got crossbows, the Genoese crossbowmen. Now, the longbow, as I say, were about 6 feet long. A typical longbow archer would carry somewhere between 60 and 72 arrows, and he could fire those at a rate of 6 arrows per minute at long distances. And in fact, they used so many arrows that for one series of battles, the English had 26 million arrows sent over to Brittany. They had everyone in England who could possibly making arrows, because they could go through them so quickly. 6 a minute. Now, on the other hand, the crossbows, anybody could learn to shoot a crossbow pretty quickly. A crossbow could be very effective, especially at shorter distances. But you can only shoot 1 crossbow bolt every 1 to 2 minutes versus 6 arrows every minute. So the rate of fire was extraordinary. It's also true that because a crossbow requires for the person using it, as you can see it right here, to lean over and, you know, load the thing, you always had to have somebody else with the crossbowman who had a shield in order to keep him from getting shot by a longbow while he was trying to load his crossbow. So while it was more difficult to find people who knew how to shoot a longbow well, the English had perfected that. I mean, everybody could shoot a longbow growing up, and it was much faster, much more deadly. So the English had about 14,000 soldiers. The French army had somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000, so slightly more than twice as many. They come together, and the Genoese crossbows are fighting against the longbows. The bottom line is the English completely swept the field. They destroyed the French army that was more than twice as many. And this was the first of the three great, really significant victories during the 100 Years' War. They had a lot of other victories. But the Battle of Crecy was one they could celebrate. An army half the size from England, using the crossbow, defeated the French army. From there, after the Battle of Crecy, which is in the north of France, they needed resupply. The English needed resupply. And so they marched a little bit further north to the city of Calais, which is a port city, and they besieged the port city of Calais for about a year before they finally broke in. And as I said before, once they captured Calais, even later on when they lost all the rest of the territory in France, England continued to have control of the city of Calais until 1558, 212 years. It was an English port in France. As I mentioned to you, in 1348, 47, 48, 49, the Black Death came along. It's believed that the Black Death actually originated in China and went to Mongolia, or the other way around perhaps, but we think from China to Mongolia. And one of the ways it got to England is because during the Battle of Kaffa, the Mongol warriors were besieging Kaffa, and some of their people started dying from this mysterious illness. Well, the Mongols started throwing those bodies by catapult over the walls. And it's believed that this is the first example of that we know of so weapons of mass destruction kind of thing, where they're using bacterial agents. The Black Death, we don't often call it the bubonic plague anymore because they're now thinking that it was a combination. Bubonic, pneumonic plague, a couple of other things. There may have been some anthrax thrown in there. But for the most part, it was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which was carried in rats and the fleas on those rats. So it was carried by ship from the east and brought in, and every port where ships were ended up seeing the Black Death. Again, 50 to 60% of all the population died from this. It fundamentally changed the culture and society of Europe. And during this period of time, the war subsided. But you know what? People being who they are, as soon as the worst of the plague went away after 1350 or so, they started fighting each other again. The war picked back up. The war in 1356, the English won the next major battle, which is the Battle of Poitiers. And this is the one in which the French king, King John, was captured. His son was captured. A lot of the rest of French nobility ended up being captive of the English at this point. It was because of this that the French signed the Treaty of Bretagne in 1360. They paid a large ransom. They guaranteed other properties, including Aquitaine would be the property of England, and everything seemed fine until 1369, when it all broke out again because the French decided they wanted to take Aquitaine back. Remember I told you how valuable Aquitaine was? So when Charles V took the throne in 1364, he rebuilt the army, he reorganized it, and then they started back in and regained territory. So they thought that it had ended after the Battle of Poitiers and the Treaty of Bretagne, but it didn't. One of the problems that the French king had was he was not only fighting the British and the British allies, he was fighting other French nobles. Burgundy especially, and some of the other provincial areas, were in rebellion against the King of France and therefore were allying with the English. The primary issue for them is the same issue we talked about when we talked about the Stuart kings in England, and that was the extent of power that the king would have. Later on, under the Louis, the French decided that the king was the divine rights of kings, that the king was put in place by God, and that they had absolute power. They could do whatever they wanted, and it had to be pretty dramatic before they would do anything against the king. Well, they had not gotten to that point here, and so the kings of France were trying to establish themselves as having absolute authority. But you had places like Burgundy and others that didn't want to buy that, and so they were siding with the English in this war against the French throne. See where I am here. The next major battle that we'll talk about is the battle. This is the most famous battle in English history. It is the one the English would point to as being the most important battle in all of the history of England, more so than even Hastings probably. In the Battle of Agincourt, the French, this is in October of 1415, St. Crispin's Day in fact, the army under Henry had been marching back, the English army had been marching back and forth across France, sort of wanting to fight, not wanting to fight. It was a Givenchy again where they're traveling back and forth, and part of it was just to sort of go neener, neener, neener. You know, we can march all over the French land and you guys aren't going to do anything about it. And after marching for weeks, 2.5 weeks, they're running out of food. They had marched, the English army had marched 260 miles in 2.5 weeks. They're running out of food. They're trying to get up to Calais, which they control now, to resupply. The French army gets in front of them. And they end up meeting at a place called Agincourt. And again, the French significantly outnumbered the English army. They come together. The problem that the French had here was the field of Agincourt was it was a narrow valley, and it had recently been plowed for crops, probably winter wheat or something like that because of October, or else they had just turned the dirt over after the crop of the summer. And the French were still relying very, very heavily on armored knights. The French knights were supposed to be the most powerful warriors in the world, and they wore heavy armor. The average French knight would wear 60 pounds of metal. Well, a French knight is of no value in defense situation. A French knight is designed to attack. And so, you know, with lances and swords and all of that sort of thing. So they get to Agincourt, this huge French army against a much smaller English army. The English army was 80% archers at this point, and the French knights start trying to attack. They're walking across a muddy plowed field wearing 60 or sometimes 70 pounds of armor. They've got all of these longbowmen shooting at them, and the biggest danger to somebody in armor from an archer were the openings on your helmet, your eye holes, or what other, you know, the helmets were designed differently. And so these guys are walking along in the mud in 60 to 70 pounds of armor, trying to keep their head down, and they're having to step over the dead, their own soldiers who were either dead or wounded that had already been shot. And it was just a disaster for them. They ended up bogging down. The English did have some cavalry. The cavalry were able to make a mess of them. They estimate that, one estimate is that there were as many as 10,000 French dead versus 1,600 English dead. Some sources say that the ratio was 10 to 1. 10 French dead to every single Englishman killed. This is the most extraordinary victory in the history of English warfare, and therefore is the most important battle. Now this victory for Henry V made him a hero in England, and in fact it allowed him to raise a lot more money to pursue the war. In 1420 at the Treaty of Troyes, or Troyes, they made Henry V, this is where he is made the regent of France. He is promised, he's given the daughter of Charles VI as his wife. He is promised that he or his heir will become the king of France once Charles dies, and it's all looking great. The only problem is that Henry dies before Charles does, and then Charles VII, who comes along, is Charles the Mad, and he doesn't want to give away the throne, and so they start fighting over it again. This is why this took 116 years. At this point, this is right at the point when Charles VII comes into it, that Joan of Arc comes along. Joan of Arc, from 1430 on, helps France regain the ground they'd had, despite the major loss in 1415 in Agincourt. Joan was a young girl, a young French girl. She's called the Maid of Orleans. She's not from Orleans, but one of the first things she did was help lift the siege at Orleans. She presents herself to the court of France, to Charles VII, and says, God has given me a message. I am to help drive the English off of French soil and free our nation. And at first they, of course, all think she's crazy. She says she has been given words from the Archangel Michael, from St. Margaret and St. Catherine, and that she will be responsible for driving the French away. Now, they gave her armor. She cut her hair. She never carried a weapon. You see pictures from time to time of her carrying a sword, like here. She never carried a sword. She never actually went into battle. She was simply a morale factor. So when she came along, the first thing she did was, the English had been besieging the city of Orleans for 6 months, very successfully. Orleans was at the point of being ready to give up. Joan of Arc rides up, and the English are so shocked by this young woman coming up here, even though she's dressed in what looks like battle gear, they let her through. She rides into the city, she talks with the people in the city, and then the English let her back out. She comes back with supplies, and the English let her through. 9 days after Joan shows up, the English stop their siege, and Orleans is saved. And all of a sudden, King Charles, the VII of France, and all of his advisors are saying, maybe we got something here. Well, after she lifted the siege of Orleans, she then traveled north, this is Orleans here, to the city of Pepe, and they had a major battle between the English and the French armies at Pepe. The French had not won a battle in 16 years, not since Agincourt. They had lost over and over and over again, no matter how many troops they had, no matter how well supplied they were. And remember, their supply lines are very short. They're in their own country. The English are fighting them far away from home. Well, Joan rides up to Pepe. She encourages the troops there, and they are successful in winning a significant battle, the first time since Agincourt the French have won a major battle. Not too long after that, after Joan has helped at the Battle of Pepe, she is captured in May 23rd of 1430, and she is turned by the Burgundians. Remember, the French Burgundians were allied with the English? She's captured by the Burgundians. They turn her over to the English. The English put her on trial using a French bishop as the judge, but it was a French bishop who was very much in favor of the English. He was an Anglophile. He was on the English side. Well, this bishop finds Joan guilty of a whole series of crimes, including dressing like a man, various other unwomanly things that were considered crimes back then. And on the 30th of May of 1431, at age 19, she is burned at the stake. As you see here, here's a picture of the questioning that she received. There have been a lot of movies, stories, books about her. The interesting thing was that this happened in 1430. In 1456, Pope Calixtus III examined the transcript, the materials from the trial, and he pronounced that Joan had been innocent and that she was a martyr to the faith, because that Calixtus ruled that she had been killed because of her religious conviction. All the way up, we fast forward 450 years until 1909. Joan is beatified by the Catholic Church in 1909. She is canonized in 1920 and becomes Saint Joan. And to this day, she is a patron saint of France. She is one of the most popular of the saints and one of the most popular literary characters. So St. Joan. By this time, she has helped Charles VII. And by the way, along the way, she arranged, because Charles VI had died and Charles VII had taken over control, but he hadn't been crowned yet. She is the one that arranges for him to be crowned in the cathedral at Rheims. And so they gave her credit for establishing him as the king. The war continues after this, and this is what it looked like when they started. All right, this was what the parts that England had. Then, if you go to 1360, they had controlled much more in the south. You go to 1429, they had lost part of Aquitaine, this area down here, but they had controlled pretty much all of the north. And then, by 1453, thanks to the assistance of Joan, at the end of the war, they have lost all of the property. The English have lost all of the property here. They only retain control of Calais, the one city. There are several effects that the 100 Years' War had. One, it really helped to create an independent sense of nationalism in both England and in France. Before that, because the English were speaking French, they they owned part of the land in France, there was kind of a mixture of things going on. It was not real clear. But by the time we get to the end of this, we have English-speaking kings in England. The English don't control anything other than one city in France. And you sort of have defined a nationalism for the English and the French. They still don't get along very well, even though they fought on the same side in some wars. There's always the jokes back and forth. But they did have a clear sense of independent nationalism. There also was a real change in warfare. The mounted knight went out with the 100 Years' War because it just wasn't efficient anymore. They were not working in battle. The longbow and other projection weapons. This is the first war that they ever used in Europe that they ever used cannon. They weren't very sophisticated cannon, but they did use cannon. So the idea of projection weapons, rather than all battle being, people standing face to face and trying to stab or cut or beat one another down. So projection weapons came into use. It was the rise of infantry rather than mounted. Most of the victories of the English, they won with infantry. So the idea that you had to have mounted cavalry, particularly heavy horse, as it was called, meaning the heavy armored, it simply didn't work anymore. And also, partly because of the war and partly because of the Black Death, it was the end of feudalism. Because you had more than half the people gone, all of a sudden the serfs, the common people, the ones who raised the food, had much more say about how they could live their lives and who they worked for. And so, the war contributed to that. Now, I want to give you one more little vignette here, because one of the things the 100 Years' War was that it created the War of the Roses. You remember back a minute ago I showed you that we had the 5 brothers under Edward the Third and the House of Plantagenet, and that we had various uncles having children. In fact, this is what it looks like. Edward III, he had Edward the Black Prince, who died before he did. Lionel, Duke of Clarence, which there's a lot of other stories about him, but he doesn't come into this. John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, Edmund, Duke of York, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. These are the 2 most important ones as far as we're concerned. John of Gaunt ended up being the father of Henry IV, who took over after Richard II, the son of the Black Prince, died, and then Henry V, and then Henry VI. Henry VI is the one that that would go insane. These are all of the House of Lancaster. Well, Edmund, Duke of York, when Henry VI of the House of Lancaster went mad, they ended up, Richard, Duke of York, was protector of the realm during part of the madness of Henry VI, so he was a cousin. Then Edward IV of the House of York took over as king between 61 and 70, when Henry VI seemed to be doing better, and he came back on for 2 years. When he still was having mental problems, Edward VI became king 1471 to 1483. He had 2 sons. Edward IV's 2 sons were Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Have you heard about the Princes in the Tower? There's a famous painting of these 2 young boys, one a little older than the other, wearing sort of black velvet clothes. They were the children of Edward IV. Well, because Edward V, while he became king, their uncle, Richard III, stepped in as regent. And he said to protect the boys, he put them in the Tower of London, in an apartment in the Tower of London, and they disappeared. Many, many years later, they discovered two bodies at the end of one of the construction shafts in the Tower of London, the bodies of children. And they're quite sure that those are the bodies of the two sons of Edward IV, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. And Richard III did that in order to keep Edward V from growing up and taking the throne, because Richard III was ambitious to be the king himself. So he ended up imprisoning, under the claim that he was protecting them, and then killing his two nephews. Well, the third child of Edward IV was a girl, Elizabeth. By this point, these folks have been fighting wars. The Lancasters and the Yorks are fighting what was called the War of the Roses. And it's called that because this is a painting that represents from Shakespeare's play Henry VI, Part 1, where various of the English nobles would pick roses, either white roses or red roses, to indicate which of the two houses, Lancaster or York, they would support. The white rose cymblum is the House of York. The red is the House of Lancaster. Well, in order to end all this, and the fighting and the battle and everything else, Elizabeth of the House of York married Henry VII of the House of Lancaster. So they married, Henry became king, and they formed a new line, the House of Tudor, which then leads to the most famous king in English history, of course, Henry VIII. Because Henry VII, their son, Henry and Elizabeth, their son, was Henry VIII. And we get into all that whole Stuart thing that we talked about. But, and let me back up here again. The symbol of the House of Tudor was a red and white rose to show the combination of the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Right? That's the War of the Roses. It was two brothers, the descendants of two brothers, fighting over who would be king and trying to be regent when Henry VI went mad, and then joining together with Henry VII and Elizabeth. I'm going to go ahead and put this up so that I don't forget, but any questions about any of that? There's 10,000 questions about that. This is a very complicated thing to try to talk about in 45 minutes. I apologize, it's so complicated. Any questions? This, like the Battle of Hastings, this is something that really did have a fundamental effect both on England and on France. Because, again, during this period of time, nationalism grew up, there was a clearer separation. The English kings are now speaking English instead of French. The French own their own property. It's not being owned by the kings of England. A lot of things happened there that ended up affecting history in the future.